아니 나도 거의 고발을 줘야지 탈바다 탐지기 몇고 원 토비기 달람 냠랭이 림바 될래야 기부 중요하다 투모알람 유르바다 징이 투모알람 유르바 기부 침배다 투모 기부 침배 람이 림바에 냠술 렘바를 때내 나가서 탈바 탐지기 몇고 와 토고 그래 되네기 람 냠술 렘바라 다 되네기 가서 람띵해 다 계획신이 되게 침몰에 사실 지자대 안도 계획신이 되고 쉬워래 전디네 자다 안도 계획신이 되나달라 선배된 바다 안주근이 된 바세 지게다는 계획신이 된비기 편연 가려서네 가상은 뒤니엘이야 주주로의 편연 가려서네 산요고바 토야리아 타니엘 침바당 안에 산예남 안에 지 도끼야바요야 안에 기디네 겨 치마이네 안에 계획신인디게 야고 녀야 안에 안돌레 마겨와 안에 지게 레다 녀모바디 방지 탈바다 탐지기 몇고가 토발리아 타니엘 주고레세 어두시네 뭔가 상황도 이렇게 댐비기 편연으로 시되는 주로와
Good evening. We are studying the Lamrim text, the middle Lamrim text, which presents the graduated stages to train one's mind in order to attain enlightenment. And is presented in accordance with first the trainings which are shared with a practitioner of initial capacity, then independence on that one cultivates within the trainings which are shared with a practitioner of intermediate capacity. And in dependence on those two prior sets of trainings, one is then ready to embark on the trainings of a practitioner of supreme capacity. So these are the varying stages in which one trains one's mind, cultivating various spiritual paths that lead to the attainment of liberation from the suffering realms of samsara and the attainment of enlightenment itself. To be able to train one's mind successfully, developing these varying paths, we need a skilled spiritual teacher who can illuminate the various methods by which we cultivate these paths within. So therefore, we have been looking for the past few months at the section on how to rely on a spiritual teacher. And last time we concluded looking at the benefits of relying on a teacher. And we saw there in the section that it's mentioned amongst the many benefits that it leads to our rapid progression towards the attainment of enlightenment, that we will never be deprived of spiritual teachers, that we will not fall to the lower realms, and nor will we be easily overcome by strong afflictions. So these were amongst some of the many benefits of relying on a spiritual teacher.
댐비 팬데 요래서지 아니지 댐비게 당아서 겨워주는데 디바 다야로시네 당아서긴 냐마게다 디바 첨부슈 사지 디테부 동아 슈첨부 연구에 쉬베이네야 안에 세델이야 안가서 지tö스 거나야다 되게 세델이야 내나서를 중제 제부되는 시민제는 뭐바나 아니 지게 되게 가소리 동안요 뭐야지 제거를 해서자
Moreover, we also saw last time how through relying on one's spiritual teacher, training in the way one's guided to, one will both accumulate extensive stores of virtue and purify past non-virtue and refrain from further misdeeds. And past non-virtues will either potentially be completely eliminated or reduced to the extent that when they ripen, instead of having the strength to propel one to the lower realms, one will experience them merely as illness or even perhaps in dreams. So let's turning to the text and we come to the next section, which is the faults of not relying correctly on a spiritual teacher.
chima nganjur dunga pato meba nyongor yurde esa.
So in the published book, we just below halfway on page 41, in the handout, we are at the top of page 48. If you take someone as your spiritual teacher and then relinquish your reliance on him, you will be harmed by illness and evil spirits in this life, and in future lives you will have to experience the immeasurable sufferings of the lower rebirths.
Tenzu lo se shin tenzu ten tangwa lama ten chil lama tilya anjike katangwa da anjike nyoba tsawa cheba la soba cheba na da shin tenzu lo ba sigurwa anjenik cheba ina anse tili ina ne da anjike sosole shengi chik jawa lamro ma juba da nyo sitike yungri sigurwa sadi di imarwa danga zuki de gasanem 샤야 지나는 거 저기 가서를 기회 신일에 된줄로는 균주 제바다 될에 채와제야 기대네 꿀롱아 바 채와제바 되네게 자진의 뒤 디바라와다 디바인자 디비 데보들라 나중에 둥아지마도 영아메르와 지산 체들이네 되네게 내나서 영아 디용그레스 안니게와 치마이나 디 되네게 레다 계획 로소데 랭안바 디바티 숙체 사와데 되네 숙체디 계와 치마 간돌레기네 디기 제보다 둥아 용어야 차고를 해서지 지송거로와
Looking at the first sentence, if you take someone as your spiritual teacher, so perhaps you receive initiation from someone or you receive teachings from them and you take them as your teacher, but then later you turn your back on them, you turn away from them. And most probably with going through that process, so this is as we have translated here, and then you relinquish your reliance on him. In that process of relinquishing your reliance on him or turning your back on him, you're likely to criticize him, to complain about him, and so forth. And this is non-virtuous. Therefore, due to making the non-virtuous karma that comes to criticizing, complaining about your spiritual teacher, then when that non-virtue ripens, it will ripen, as we see here, for example, it being by illnesses or being perhaps born in the lower realms.
아니네 대인자다 되네기 간제 제고 디비디고 자동한 용어를 쓰이다 되는 디나이드노 김전제대 라마 ngopjubal에 사지 디날마 남야 로빈 다기니 군도 심주 미자데스 갈데 몽베 제규나 녀월게 버 체버 규루스 날멜라소 지수 지rum비 녀와 템바 간임바 로벨라니 메바남 데니 네버 양다시에스
And this is further explored in quotations in 2 verses from the 50 verses on the Guru. Never agitate the minds of any of your masters. If you do so out of stupidity, you will surely roast in hell. It was explained authentically that all those who disparage their masters will dwell in the horrific hells that were taught, like the Avicii.
남야 로빈 다기니 군도 셈주 미자데 세데지나다 소수게 라마텐 세베젤야 라말야 균죄제나 라말야 뇌세제다 라말야 안지 셈마기와 강하제야지 누치교 말해서 남야 로빈 다니 군도 셈주 미자 셈주 바지나 셈마기와 쇠바 강하제 로와도스네 지교 말해서.
The first 2 lines in the first verse, never agitate the minds of any of your masters. So here one is being advised to not act in a way that disturbs the mind or agitates the mind of your spiritual teachers.
안데니게다 데니 제바이나는 제부 가려용으로서는 갈데몽베 제교나스데다 갈데몽베 제교나스는 아두도 제디 then Lamalia, the Niki chicken and the lodge, Lama Tenzo, Delia, Gunja, Lamaki, the Garci was just Manazula, Chick or the Lama de Yapuchama, the Bedu, Lama de Corolla, Lamaya, and Manazuki, Lotaki, Corolla, Delia, never does TV, somebody, some given, Mumpa Maripa, Numobe, Numo, Ongitus Chinchi or Wasura. The Nijabana, and the Devo de la Carigosene, and the Chigi, the Devo, Nyawa. Nyawang several Jews, Nyawalia, Giri said, and several Jews said it, Benny Nyawa by the Corsore, Denicate Saviki, Nanya, Sani Toboda, and Dinalia, and Narmeba, Sildan, Nyawa Narmela Sopa, Chisurubi, nearly, on to Sli Giri, and Tangile Nyawa, never several Jew, Narmela, several Juviki, Narme, several Jews, and Narme said Chivas, on the Dineda, Dinadeda. Narmeda, Dinegi, Sogonada, Neviki, come Jubia Mongwera, so on Dinejus, Chisurubiki, and Yawa, Chisurubiki, Netisuri, or Dagaji, Yawa, Tempa, Kayan Basil, Dinegi, Nevi, Nedin, the Yore, said, Din, Dusma, Dingor, Dingo, Dinashin, Dinegi, Dimbi, Netusulia, Gigore, Esach, Gigri, Esach. There's not Gariskin Kim Lubala Murba, no Suki, Lubalia, Anchige, Tinsu Lodge, Della Lamala, Chikunja Chabata, Nova Chair, and Sewa Chipic, Samlongamba, Yelamala, Tushin, Denitis, Tisumitican, Dene Yada, never said, near to Solia, and to ski or res, Tushin, Sumba res or shears, the Sumba res.
Explaining then, or looking at both verses. So if one does engage in activities that disturb the mind of one's spiritual teachers, the results that will follow we have then in the next two lines. If you do so out of stupidity, or it's a word I usually translate as confused ignorance. So if you do so out of stupidity or confused ignorance, through that it will one will create the causes to be born in the lower realms, even in the hells. And this is because if one is criticizing one's teacher or turning one's back on one's teacher, one is likely to have many non-virtuous minds. Perhaps one will be angry and then speak in an angry manner, or will have the affliction of malice directed towards one's teacher. And the karmic results of such stupidity or confused ignorance would be to be born in the lower realms. Then in the second verse, the first line in the Tibetan is the fourth line. So being born in the lower realms, such as the hell of Avisi, which is the most extreme of the many hell realms. So that is the potential rebirth that follows from having anger towards one's Lama and so forth. And so that's a lot. Then the last two lines of the second verse will dwell in the horrific hells that were taught like the Avisi. So that's the result that will come. Then the beginning of that verse, because in the Tibetan the order is a bit different, it was explained authentically or correctly that all of those who disparage, so the Tibetan word is very strong here, revile the Lama or loathe their Lama. So in other words, someone who has such a harsh attitude towards their teacher that they loathe him or revile him, they will have the karmic result that will follow is to be born in the hells. And this was explained correctly or authentically. Last.
Lama tenso loba ina azuki ane devu kari yungure sidi devu di ane jinyawa la sopa sidi nyawa la ya rimba da dunga nyosa mangbu yune nye tisole kigiri esaji ane yu gari la na ye yudi gari la na lama ya anchige lama loja lama ya ane chigi makibo suya sem tuya matibo suya da kanga teya da ane sun chigi tusi lama ya Gyunje Chabana, Kondoja, Tsewe Samba, on this Gyudesolatin Gigore Essage, the Nadiro, Gyuchita, Gudelatin, Debutin, the Yungre Essage.
In brief, then, the meaning is that if one creates if one turns one's back on one's teacher, then one is likely to do so with a particularly negative mind. So one is likely to disturb the mind of one's teacher through criticizing him, being angry at him, and so forth, loathing him, disparaging him. And through creating such causes, the karmic result that will follow is likely to be a rebirth in the lower realms, even in the most extreme of the hell realms. Then there's a further quotation, a passage from the commentary on difficult points of, and this says, "Whoever hears a single verse and does not apprehend the Guru will be born among dogs 100 times, and then as someone of low caste." Just to maybe change the second line slightly, apprehend and does not apprehend as a Guru, or hold as a Guru. So instead of the, it should be as a.
Lama de la Nye, Lama de Che, and Jig, Che, Unibunyamba, Nye, Kuwa, Madagaje, Che, Sixam Nyambalina, Sosugi, Lama Loma Tiag, Dubukunia, Lantusine, Lama de Che Shubana, Che, Sixi Nyamba Chini, and the Jig Lama Charua, Dineza Denigi, Lama Tenche, Lama Nzimbache, Lama, Lama Dene. And the Gangi Lamar Mizimba, and Delia, and Sosugi, and Gyunchi Tonchi Lamalia, Gyun Tontini, me, Chilama de Lama Tensu Loba in Nasu Mizimba, that Lama Tingi said Lama Lobaina, and the Niki Lamalia, Taviki, Nyomo, Badigi, Tebu, Kariungri, Lamna, Nekewachima, and Gasore, Chike, Ki, Gine, Jargene, Kila Sopic, Simjan Dundogi, that Dundogi Yawalang, Kiroji, Pero Sharua. 지난 길어서 백 되네게 dunduge 길어서 되네게 깨와 자르고슬래 다 되네게 깨와 잘련 산에 제절에 미 깨와len 바이나양 메시전도 깨와 주로스디 다 메시전에 대한 지간 밤이 되네게 가지고 다 되네게 나는 기기래 사실 다 지간 바시도 가지 메시전에서도 당하지 지게 더스가 강하 유되게 근데 강야 사야도야다 데니게 되었 튼게다 강아 데니지 레가로시네 날 지강아 유디가블라 소수 동아세야 신유구모가다 샘제 소소 제와다 데니기 레가다는 제고야로 차고 디파자야 레가 레가레한지 지게 차기 차기로와 언디 메시지에서 데니를 고고르다 저기 직다 비슷하다디 아주 밀 깨와 렘바이나야 튼게다 데니게 강아 유바질이야 아니지 레가로시네 아직 디비 레가 먹고 제디가 되네게 야 기래 사실 양 메시지에서 가시네 아직 샘제 디브라자 세 디브라냐 세저와 땡 가소래 되네게지 디네다래 세 비슷한 거도 당보 라마테 디네 라마를 견주던 제 손주여로 다티로 같이 지금 라마 된 손주는 지금이 지금 라마 된데 손주여 저로 된디로 진짜 최슈고로 최마슈는 라마 지게 차스가야 말하거든 직슈고로 슈치는 라마 된 최슈 되는 흔들야 직도 라마들 로바 있나 지소로다 나던다냐 시아디 지바지바래다
I'm looking now at this verse, whoever hears a single verse. So this shows that one does not need to have relied for a lengthy period of time on a teacher to create immense negative karma by then turning your back on him. So even if one has recently taken someone as a teacher and only received a single teaching from him, then if one turns one's back on them one will be creating immensely bad negative karma. Whoever hears a single verse and does not apprehend him as a guru. So this then means that having taken someone as a teacher, but then turns away from them, criticizing them, disparaging them, and so forth. So the sequence is one takes someone as a teacher, which means one is receiving teachings, but one doesn't have to have received a lot, for if one then turns one's back on him, through criticizing and disparaging and so forth, to accrue immense non-virtue. And the karmic result of that would be to be reborn, as we see in the third line, in the lower realms, such as in the animal realms, for example, as a dog. So again, this says it's not that you are necessarily born as a dog, but you're born in the lower realms, for example, as a dog. Or in the fourth line, if you are born as a human, you're born of someone of low caste. So how we should understand this term low caste? It refers to people it refers to a time when people's employment and their social standing and their material wealth was dictated by caste. So if someone was born into a low caste, the kind of work they could do would be the work that the rest of society looked down on and didn't want to do themselves. And that kind of work often involved creating a lot of non-virtue, such as being butchers and so forth. So one would be, in a sense, forced into such employment because of the caste in which you are born. Society prevents one from doing other kinds of work. Therefore, to sustain your life, you are compelled to engage in non-virtue. Moreover, whilst you have work, your life is being sustained. You are and you remain impoverished. And then throughout your life, being an outcast from society, you are still, not only are you an outcast from society, not only are you having to engage in demeaning work, but the work ensures you create a lot of non-virtue and therefore will continue to suffer for lives to come. So that's a rather extended explanation of how to understand the concept of low caste.
I don't know Bendigo Lama tenso loba ina Bendigo Hungary Session sigurwa I don't know do sine samdana ni dana kasore Lama chaya de gi chagires Lama tenso loya de loba sede cero chikane shiri de ni chikane shilau to na kane shilawres Lama de chumashina Lama loba rebe mares Lama tenso loba rebe mares do sine ga chikior wat chi zero jiaji.
Having heard here then about the faults of turning away from relying on a teacher, and the verses presented in quite a graphic form, then the thoughts will come, so what does it entail to turn away from a teacher? How could it possibly be that the results would be this bad? So thoughts like this should arise.
Lama chaya chakwa siyo marwa chue xie dan chue nyanga le ya an jige chue nyanga ina so su gi xie ni jaya ge chidu xie ti jaya chidu so lama tian ge de ba me ba ne di za le ya xie ni jaya ge sam da chi nya ro chung gu wa an ya ji ba chue xie dan chi nya ne ji lama lo me ge ji shi ma xia chen chue zhou hui chu chue ro ge chu gi an du xie ne ge ji ge 지글라야 다 자야 되는 용거로와 진짜 니네자 최년바 잠기 네 로마차요 말에 네 라마차요 라마 로마게 대화 차스게 차스게요 말에 나가네 라마 로마게 대화데 간에 차기를 랐나 단 로마디게야 라마디젤야 최슈기인 선비게 라마디젤는가 최슈기인 라마디데 제 라마디젤는게 최슈기인 그런게 라마디젤는게 최슈기인 선비게다 네 주주진 냠내지기 세베게다 소수기 뭐바 아니 눈바 되냐게 아니 라메네 아당이 콜리아데 직최신의 지구선 비게 라메게 한다 시게 두신의 신의 지구선 두신 다시 해나 안 최 직제직 년배는 라마 로마게 저와 차사래 인지미 최 먹무 년과요 말에 제산다 라마들이야 안쪽에 라마 디자인의 최 윤이 우시에게 라마 연구래 안 최 차르직니 쉬네 내 라마 되니 윤이 쉬야 매비 고갑 말아와제 쉬야 말아베 라마야 연구로와 안진지 라마 디자인의 최쉬 왕쉬 맹하쉬 원로 맹하 안 더머쉬 차사쉬디비 되네 라마 연구라 라마라 되네게다 아주게 망호 연구로 와 되네.
What is being described here is where a student has made the conscious decision to rely on a spiritual teacher as their spiritual teacher. This is different from where one is receiving teachings, but one has not, from the side of the student, one has not made that conscious decision that this person, I am relying on them to guide me. They are my spiritual teacher. They are my guide to the attainment of enlightenment. So where such a relationship hasn't been formed, and again it's formed by the student having this thought that this is my spiritual teacher, where such a relationship hasn't been formed, then the relationship is one of a Dharma friend, not of a teacher-student relationship. So what is not being described here is where one is receiving teachings from someone, but your relationship is just one of a Dharma friend. What's referred to here is where the student has made the commitment from their side that this person is my spiritual teacher upon whom I'll rely to guide me in the cultivation of the various paths to enlightenment. And when one has made that commitment, then if one doesn't need to have thereafter have a lengthy teacher-student relationship before, if one were to turn your back on them, you would create the non-virtue described here, merely receiving a single teaching or a single verse. Then, to break that commitment, to sever that commitment, one would be creating that non-virtue. So when one has committed to a teacher, then when one continues to form the relationship through receiving teachings, perhaps initiations, vows, and so forth, then that relationship becomes ever closer and stronger.
Lama matin baje wang xue mere, la wang xue na tade che xue na inji mi ji che nyen na lama tin gua yo ma re si chi la ba ge. Wang xue na inji mi ji lama tin ko re, lama matin na wang xue mere, lung xue da, wang xue da, dom xue da, ce sa lama tin ko matin ba na ande ne ge wang xue ge mere de. Lung ya le.
So here, I want to make a distinction. This relationship of a Dharma friend, this one can have in the context of receiving spiritual teachings from someone. Where one receives an initiation or receives any other classes of vows or receives oral transmissions, then through engaging in that act with the teacher, one is creating a teacher-student relationship, regardless of whether one makes the intentional thought that this person is now my teacher. If one's receiving an initiation, vows, or an oral transmission, that relationship is necessarily formed. But on the other hand, if one is receiving Dharma teachings, there the relationship of teacher and student is not necessarily formed unless, from the student's side, in their mind, they generate the intentional thought that this person is my spiritual teacher.
지겨움지로지나 저거름지나 소수가 라마는 윤 라마 된 차와지 라마치 나 라마디젤의 최신한 귀나 내 쉬어 줘야 그 고갑자 소수기 튕게나 소수가 고갑 말아봐나 다디는 줘야 사마라 딜라마치네 디링에 디 최디쉬야 라사 마레 삼베게 다시 디링 당하 쉬어 두메 삼베나 라마디스 로바레 베스네 마레디 라마디스 로바 마레.
Let's then look at in more detail at what constitutes turning away or abandoning one's teacher. So whomever one's teachers may be, whether it's His Holiness or Lama Zopa or whomever, let's say they are offering teachings and you choose not to attend for whatever reason, that merely non-attendance is not turning away from the teacher.
달라마디 자네가 최근에 되는 방 알라마디스는 최자우니 슈메선베게 달선타로 제베나 어디디 라마디스 로바시고 달라마디스 로바시 라마자우니 띵메세다 디린 방 알라마디스는 최슈메다 세야지파 다 기디네 다 고브라다 마라 기시오 마라 기디네다 가디zen 최슈메세다 군론 반 즉 콜레 최슈에 되버메바 안지게 즉 리그로 와도스 토나로 좀 마찬가지인 그 최슈 먹어 김재지어로 받아 다 최슈 다 소수게 다 강한테 유튜브사 말에 삼바에 내내 그 베네스타제 타디는 유튜브사 말에 삼바에 디즈니스로 다 디린 바슈고 매 삼바데 디즈네 다 고갑라나 말나 기디네다 그런나 디즈네 디즈네 사원이네 다 슈메 삼베게 파셈다 제제 마오반데네 슈메 삼바에 파시 다면 로바로 차고를.
So to make it clear the distinction between choosing not to receive a teaching and turning your back on that teacher. Let's say a teaching is being offered, and for whatever reason you choose not to go, and you just let's say, for example, I can't afford the flight, or I'm a little tired, or I have something to do, something like that. It's not a adverse motivation. On the other hand, if one chooses not to go to a teaching with a thought, I've had enough of receiving teachings from my teacher, and I won't be doing it again. Whether I have the opportunity or not, I've had enough, I'm not going again, this is not for me, or he is not for me. There's hopefully a clear distinction between I can't now, as opposed to I will not again. So the difference in the mind should be very clear. The one is really where you turn your back on the teacher in the sense of, I've had enough, I'm not doing this anymore. Whereas the other side, which is where you're not turning your back on the teacher, it's just for now or for at the moment, I cannot. But this is not. But it comes with no negative or hostile attitude.
Den ma melon ma chi ya le bane melon ya loba la girwa chisan lametin su loba si de khalsone de jinye ya ni lamade tingi lamade sin shugin samlodi chasan de dangorwa nda garji orsna nda samlodi su logo da nga disan de chushu me da di nga tingi me chushu me sambe samdan de samlodi su chushu gi dangbo chushu da lamade tingi disan de chushuin se be samlo da adi Su lo chene da tingi me jitin chushu me sambi samno zala me tin su lo ba se de lo se de su cho lo ba re san samno di dangbo samno di su tingi se lama tingi se de ba che de le tingi se me ba che tingi se khelen damja che da di khelen damja da tingi me da lama tingi dizen chushu me se be samta na de ji khelen damja de lo so ro da jina lama tin su lo ba se di tin se la go da.
So this word that I'm translating as to turning your back on the teacher, it's used in many circumstances. So for example, if we go to Melbourne and we return from Melbourne, it's the same word, the word of returning from Melbourne. It's the same word as I'm translating it, to turn your back on the teacher. Because it's the opposite of the initial attitude, which was, I want to receive teachings, to one of, I won't receive teachings from you again. So it can be the physical expression of this attitude is one of turning your back on the teacher. I do not want to hear another word you have to say. I do not want to be in your presence any further. So it is this almost physical turning your back on the teacher, turning away from them. But it's expressed as a mental attitude of turning away from them.
아니 디발 마소나 치숑 사간 망부용으로와 디바 치숑 사간 망부용거래 데데 데네게 가시 데네다 띵메 SMB게다 데제네 최슈금에다 디린 말라메 띵이 최슈금에 SMB게 삼로지 로치네 안디나야 라마딜레 균주에서야단 콜야직 강아제야단 가마제 받을 지용으로와 그리고 강아 맞아 균주에 맞아 소속에 도시네 직 낭메 샤샤 용으로와 가시야 안직 댄소 로버스 디가블라 균주에 쉬우셔다 디데데데 실패 독자를 인이에서 균주에 다디 디바망아 사고로와 셈 비스 균주에 아니 전에 소소 가서 소소 유라 콘로다 뇨모 망아기오라 된 디바망아 디로와 다디 마세 아니 양 릭질야 데니기 균주에 마세 안직 강아제야다 아니 녀다다야 용식으로와 녀다다야 용서 전가나로 루바 용식으로와 안데네진에 아직 대솔야 안지게 디발마 체사사그로와 지산 전가나 다다 예동 다다 소소 죄발라 소바 체벤다 디바치모사그로와 디지다 디네자 다디데네 마시에서야디 지당의 마시그르마도지 다데 라마로 텐솔나 냐와지오르 둔라지 세세세야디 지단의 시그로와 근데 디나데 안에 가르스키르세도 디베 체슈는 빠파요. 소소게 라마 로소텔라 라마 로베 카블야 안티살로 소소게 군노다 냠바다 소소게다 뇽모바 슈 소소게라 뇽모바 디바 가지 슈치에 사바네 디데부 동안 슈치에 녀아이로와다 아도스토나 디레
So to turn one's back on one's teacher, this comes from a mental attitude of I do not want to receive teachings from him again. So it's this clear severing from the side of the student, severing of the relationship. And it's from that mind that non-virtue is created and problems and suffering follows. But the point to make is that the illustrations given in the text, we should take these as illustrations in that the mind of turning one's back on the teacher, there are gradients in strength of that negative mind. It can be relatively milder, stronger, or extremely strong. So if one turns one's back on one's teacher, and one doesn't make a big thing of it, and doesn't have a particularly strong negative attitude, that will result in that's still non-virtuous, but the negative results that will follow will be much lighter than the attitude that is most or more likely to be cultivated, which is independence on having a negative attitude towards one's teacher. This will come through seeing faults, believing that those faults really exist, and then one is likely to criticize him, to complain about him, to criticize him perhaps to his face or to others, complaining about him. This, of course, now, the afflictions are much stronger, so therefore more non-virtue is created. And the afflictions may even lead to physical violence from the student. The student may be so overwhelmed by anger that they assault the teacher. And therefore, the non-virtue would be even stronger. So therefore, when we read the text and we see about being born in the hells, even in the most extreme of the hells, or as an animal, or as a low-caste human, we can see there is a gradient in ripening results. They are all negative, but what determines the ripening result is the strength of the animosity towards the teacher.
denso loba sedi dine che de dine Nangazuki Dirwada Pene, Nangazuki Zoangazuki, Samlun Alan Maki Shigaruba, Samlutone, Jisan Samluki Kishi, Gawasa said, and Divasa said, Sosu Samlutine, Sosuke Samlu Kunlung Ambada, Kunlung Ambache, and the Kunlung Ambada, Troy Sambana, Skache, Shukche Givena, Nangazuki, Neve Samba Shukchikaze Givene, Di Shukinje, Ginchin, Lunga Javade, Shukshe Tuyata. Nebe somebody Shuchunga Mother Gigman, Lunga Javade, Chunga Yungurua. It's not the name that Zuki, the nigger Nube Samba, the name Save Samba, the name Samba Tukja. That's somebody, Tangazuki, D. Shuki, Nubados Mahana, as the same numbership at the same meeting to Palado, Shasha Gore. It's not the Lomangu, Chimbene, that the Nubadi, Debuki, Nubayon, Nubaza, the Nubadi, Debuting Anzuli, Yungo, Chagorua. Nengazu Gawaro Chibarwa, Gawa Kase Sabe, Nengazu Gawa Kazero Sabine, that Kase Sabina, Di Nubaru Shukche, Semnala Shayo, Semnala, Dushine, Bene, Anzuga, Lo, Jujong and Yella Gawa Sasha, Jebudi, said Lo Jujong and Gel Juya, and Gawa Chima Juya Ungurwa. Just the Nuba the Semnala Yobarwa. Just the Yobaza, Nubadi Debuji Nimachi Mingorwa. Just the Dangazuki Dibasa, Gawa Sasha. Digi Nubadi Sem Nalia, Debu Dungayoyaki, Guti Sai, Dikbares, or Digi Debu Dungayoyaki, Nubadi, Sem Nala Shagore. Kawasadi, Debu Digiyoyaki, Nubadi Semitone, some knowledge in the court, Digi Tene, Nubadi Semit in the Shagadu, that the Chisuan, Dibudi, Dungayoya, that Diyoya, Chesa. Denero, there's a dang of Semit and the Shagu, but the some don't do Gore, she's a desert, some not down Hadi, Jesna Jiggy, Deni Dungayoyagi, some not down Rikin, Tagio Mares, she's not that the Yoyagi, Riki, somebody on the position, and the Komori, get down Gore, such. She's not the Diso, and Nazuki Disungora, she's not the Givation Yalia, and and the Jiga, Jesu Iran, and Deva Cheva. This Samlas and Gavares or Digitivu and the Digitiungres, just somebody nobody has accepted the Shagor, Digitivudi, and as you are in Malaysia. Then gave Shinya, Gunji, Chica Semba Napoche, Tangate, and Din Cheven, Din Samlodi, Yomo Badawa. Just did nobody send in the Shagor, did Devudi do a more but Yungres, Donadisumurua.
Throughout every day, variety of minds just keep ripening within us, one after the other. Some will be on the side of virtue, others will be on the sides of non-virtue, the sides of the afflictions. So some will be virtuous minds, such as minds of love or wisdom, others will be afflictions. And these minds, if they're weak, they'll just come and they'll go. If they're a little stronger, then they'll abide a little longer, impacting our mood, for example. And if they're a little stronger, we may well express them. So let's say there's a lot of afflictions are ripening. Perhaps the mind is just quite black that day, very angry, complaining a lot. Then what is one likely to do? One's walking around with this head of pain, probably a facial expression that's similar, and when you meet someone, they're going to hear about what's going on inside. You're going to complain at them. You're going to complain maybe about them. You're going to complain about a variety of things. And if you're particularly unhappy, you may even respond to a small stimuli with aggression, with violence. So this just is how it is for beings, that there's a variety of minds going off all the time. And if they are stronger, they have a greater impact. They may impact speech. And if they're a lot stronger, they'll impact our physical behavior. And this certainly is the case for our afflictions, but it's also the case for our virtuous minds. If we are making effort to cultivate virtuous minds, love, compassion, ethics, wisdom, and so forth, and these are ever more dominant within us, our mind will be more at peace. And if these minds are a bit stronger, not only will our mind be a little bit calm, but when we encounter others, no matter how they are acting to or around us, our mind will stay stable and calm. We'll talk to them in loving ways because our mind will be dominated by a variety of virtuous minds. And where we have the opportunity to help, we'll help. And we'll do so readily without needing to be asked. And we'll do so with joy, with sincerity. Why? Because our mind at that time is dominated by virtuous ways of thinking. So this is the case for all of us at all the time. And on whichever side the mind is, whether it's on the side of afflictions or the side of virtue, the stronger the minds are that are ripening and being acted on, the stronger the karmic imprints are that are being created. And if the minds are fairly weak, the karmic imprints will be fairly weak, and therefore the ripening results will be quite minor. But if the mind is strong, therefore the resulting karmic imprint will be strong, and therefore the ripening results from that imprint will be strong. So this is how the process works. Understanding that then, we can see the great importance of being aware of or mindful of our inner process, seeing what's happening and taking control of our mind, guiding it towards virtue, keeping it on virtue. So when we're seeing the afflictions arising, to try and deal with our minds skillfully, and move it to virtue. And in this way then, if we can strengthen our habituation to virtue and then also strengthen those virtuous minds, we'll be throughout our days accumulating virtue. And then to take it to the context of this chapter, call to mind one's spiritual teachers, one's Lama, call to mind his many good qualities and the great kindness that he shows to you and to others. In this way, you're accumulating virtue. You're strengthening your relationship with your spiritual teacher. And should afflictions arise, such as seeing faults in the teacher, don't dwell on them. Don't pursue them. Don't, in your mind, have a story of criticism. Rather let them go by drawing your mind back to his many good qualities. So this is how to deal with one's mind throughout the day, every day, not just on the cushion, but at all times. Taking responsibility for one's mind, understanding how this process I've just outlined works, and thereby keeping one's mind on the side of virtue, on wholesome qualities.
제마 디부 디기 용구레 디바체나 디부 동아 용구레 세지 디셰바 참 많이 바장 주게 다 심주 셰고디 제바 셰고디 게 좀 제거로 받아 디 제바 체바이나 어디디 된데 인사를 샘비게 네번에 중고로 봐 제바 마제번에 요래 여지 삼바 삼기 샘리야 네번 템부 nye 메레 한직 다디 간주 요래 세지 소수기 직현다 잘량에 이시를 제대로변에 마오바나 현다지기 깨라치 뭐지기 어디 요 말에라는 진이 교와서 고하듯이 시스는 안되니 이제 어디 문에 코디에 인사를 선배기다 매화를 선배기 삼는래야 인가 용거 저는 소수기 심주제 딘베지나래 주여를 딘레세 손샤바딜이야 심주제 제바체도 제바 융천 삼다 어디디 된데 인사를 딱 용시스디 요사를 선배기 삼르디 내가바시 이래기다 소수기 내바로 직된된을 통사베나 현다 깨라치 뭐 수도 수이나직 레사지기 말에람나 소수기 김전 통화한자 그셔야지 대통령 저기 지스토마로와 가서는 김세로 통고로와 통사로와 지난 뒤에 자데 내번이야고디 심주체 제바체 간스 디바 간스 디데보 간스 용고래 새벽에 두스지나 저기 심주체다 제바체고야디 계시 뭐 제고래
I've just briefly mentioned then how the mind works and how we accumulate the happiness, happy results through virtuous ways of thinking. And through non-virtuous ways of thinking, that will ripen in suffering results. And moreover, there's also a gradient in terms of the strength of the karmic cause that is created. So you've heard this, and you've probably heard it many times. But if one notices that one is not really living in accordance with this teaching or any other teaching, that's good to recognize, because then what you're seeing is you haven't come to gain certainty in that topic. And your certainty could perhaps be translated, you haven't come to realize that topic. Because one may completely accept the topic, but one hasn't ascertained it or realized it. One may intellectually agree, but it's not guiding one's life yet. So what one needs to do then is investigate for yourself. So it says, for example, in this context, from virtuous karma follows results of happiness. From non-virtuous karma follows unwanted results of suffering. Merely accepting that means it's not of sufficient strength that it guides how you live your life. Moreover, when either later in this life or in a future life, when one meets a teacher, in particular one who's charismatic and is presenting something different, one may easily then be swayed by what they have to say. Whereas if you have come to a firm and definite conclusion on something, which one will come to based on reasons, then no matter how charismatic someone is, you will not be swayed. No doubts will arise in your mind because you've come to a settled determination that this is how it is. And in that way, in the future you're protected, but even right now, you live your life in accordance with the conclusions that you have come to.
제가 수부로 시대도 여바 있는다. 제가 치마 스트레스 가요 말와다. 아질레. 대체 제가 치마 동안 용거리에서 하다. 동안 용거리에서 수두고에서 내가 수부도 두고 말나 아주 다제 시세회제랑 수부디 지매가 소양 아주 통셔수기 바로 와다 수부디 매라다 가르친다 지매와 차로 걸어와. 안데지 다 수부디 매와 차도 제가 치마데 수부 두면 가르 두고에서 내가 셈데 두고 당하지. 나중에 수부기다 두생한테 삼다베네 나저 수부 구조 따나 마다 조다 마로 가래 제다 맞에나 삼노디 셈디기 직 가서 셈디기 구조 따에도 다 삼노디 코야 되네 수부디게 시선 구조 따로 삼노디기 배지 마다바나 네 수부디 구조기는 다음에 니후르도 삼노 레가레고 말아 삼노 니나 저도 저 수부기네 구조 단거 말아 미에 두고 말에 암초야 고고 말아 진짜 디나신 아주 좋어데 삼노디기 아주 류차사 류가 이 가소래 수부데 고래 미그레 차사 류 베제다데 온도 규에데 셈이 온도 규르되어다 간질에 셈이 가르제제로지 아주 라고가 왔잖아 가와 공부가 하자면 셈디기 바 비제다데 셈디기 둘바 도왔음 둘 도그래 잡로 도왔음 잡로 도그래 니 도메서는 대대도 삼삼로 대대도 삼 대대도 그래 진짜 도스네 근데 지에 조도베네 셈이가 칼라사기 메선 유네사기오 말와 진짜데 셈리디가 아주 삼로디기 도스네 도스체데 진짜 간주 수부게 계시가래 셰다 미기가라 따고도 민도 암조 가래 년도미 소 셈기 군노데 셈기 바직제 되네 셈기 도스체네 슈긴제여도 되네 류게 자와데제요 구교다 자제요 제사데 고 제사다 나중에 시도디 셈도 수부디 파카데션 된 로자 버고 로자 강부 동반하지래 강반하는 미유인데 강부 매바 강부 동반하지 제사 강부 동반다 나중에 매라다 매와서 쉐고 셈도 주고 셈도 가와 주고 서고 제가 치마셔야지 다가제 제가 치마랍나 말랍나 셈디 류가주 류디다데 가주 류디래 내중에 셈디 류디 샤아치네 류현타 찍라 不用对，他接我起码来过，大概这类。就那看我经营本的不要去看我啥我主要对那个家人做事的话，你那些给我起码来对， Nama said Anzu Dadadi, Chisna Dading Anzu Lu Len Shake, Della Tin, same day, native Bache, Chisna Deep Asha, Shah did on cottage, and Lu Shandachinal Dodi, the Kiwachimas to go. Chisna Dini Zada, Dini same to George, the Jing to Kawakaza Shine, Digi nobody, send me to the Yoba, same Koran Kawato and the nobody called in the Yorwa. Chisna Jebu the Kawato and the Koran Jebudi, Nyungu. And the dinner shing and the Duan get the same get the new Shashabas, same to Koran Gawa to you, and the Gawa and the Lusabachi Lembena, the Didier to do the young Chagoro. Then do some Davina and to get chick to shit to Yawachima said, Yawachima said, some damp chantar, what should I say? Cusi what, Yawachima, same the Lu the part Duenge, Car Deje, Lu Jandachinal Juruban, what Yawachima Lensare.
In general, people take quite good care of their body, wanting to keep it comfortable, warm, and fed. And this is important. We need to look after our body. But for ourselves as spiritual practitioners, we need to really rebalance our focus. Because from the perspective of a spiritual practitioner, people in general are overly focused on their physical welfare. So again, I want to emphasize, we do need to look after our health, but we need to ensure that we have taken a balanced approach. Because this body that we value so, when death comes, it will be left behind. This we know for certain, because it will either be buried in the ground to rot, or it will be incinerated. That will happen. But our mind continues. Our mind is what will continue to our next life. And in fact, what we talk about when we refer to our next life, really it's just our next body. Because the mind continues from one life to the next. All that really changes is the body. So this body that we focus on so much, wanting to keep it warm and comfortable and well fed and protected, will definitely get left behind. And in whatever state it is when the end comes, it will be left behind. But the mind, whatever state it is in when the end of this life comes, in that state it continues. Moreover, this body that we value so, it's actually nothing more than a slave. It has no capacity of its own to do anything. The mind is the ruler of the body. One cannot move a single limb, not even a digit, without the mind directing that. So the mind, the body itself, really is nothing more than a slave, and we should see it in that perspective. Furthermore, we can relate to it as being a guest house, somewhere where our consciousness temporarily abides. And at one point, we will check out of the guest house, leaving it empty, and we will move on to the next body. So we need to rebalance our focus, putting much more emphasis thereby, to re-express that, by rebalancing and placing less emphasis, less time and energy onto caring for our body. We should place this onto caring for our mind. Because our mind, between the two, is what is dominant. Our mind is the master, the body is the slave. The mind is the guest, whereas the body is the mere dwelling that it temporarily abides. The mind in its state with all its imprints is what continues to the new body, leaving the old one behind. So we need to place much more emphasis on developing our mind, taking care of our mind, because our mind is what is truly precious.
안디네 자당 한주게 삼류톤에 장샤교디 네 뭐바나 디부미에 여바디 다양한 세부로 봐 Bendigo Jige Lobsang Chibi Kabla, Samlo Nani, Bendigo Chaya, the Angse Chaya, the Samlo Namba Chanshabedi, then Jan Savi Chela, Jike, Lord Chuchuranchi, Beji Matabine, that did para the Jango Marvada, and Jango Matici, Lord Chuchong, a sneer Chansa, in the Jangodi. This some Yunde, the Sukas, your career, same knowledge, same day, how the same day, Nalu or Chance, nobody. She's not that nobody. Lord Jujong a jelly, a Bishdamene, and Bishda eating it. Delia Carson, a singer, singer, Chiche, Singor, Jeshingorwa. She then Bishda, Diggerson, nobody same day to Yudiva. Same day to Yuba is that, and Benanga Jigge Benanga Nimichili, the Ring Road, Lobjong, Chechix part, similar part, Chandra Jet part, similar how over there. Ma Nidu Gabla, Nigu Sare, Leka Chigo Marde, Dine and Sign do a chichidu, and sometimes legally in Lamsa, Jasha, Jehan Tata Singorwa. Diggers and Nuba the same thing to Yobarwa, and Dina Shinrwa, Dangazuki, Gewa Drubi, Gewadi, Drupshe, Gewadi, Nuba the same now Yobaza, then Gewa Chima in there, same the part who was a Nuba detail Yobaza, and Lega di Kiwi Jawa, some of the Yanka Koyoda, then Gawa Manga to Shannon Pemba, Drutuadi, Yungorova. Then is that the same to Shabe Gawa Digi, she had Mongol Pingri said, then she had been a lot Jurangi Nelia, Jansha, Jangio Lobjan Sango, the same Jamba, what Mazuki, that the Muna of Jango, Madam Lord, those Jahad, the Sui Jangu Lamna, Subu Jangu de Semi Jangu Lana, Semi Jangu Adanto. In the same Yamajana, some Lokoya Madana, Labri Genji, Yiji Labdu, Mazu Samlo de Shandaji, some Nadevene, Subudi de Mikti Tongo, Amjo, Yengo, de Ine, Lobjo de Hingimidwade, and the Mero. Just some of the part, Chikal with the Cates, some of the part, some time to the Kabla, some of the Panyane, Chihako, that he knew big how good, new body part, send a shot however. Lord Tawashi Jelly, on did bit, Bishotan Tuba. Chesnatan Zuki, Chisona, Lobjong Kardevine, Jaya to Suja on the same Gijangor, Dangela, the Chisona, same Gijangors, Bishitango, Mare, Tango or Mare, in a Donda, ships or something, Jaya to Sujangudu, Migi Jangudi, same Gijangudu, same Gijangudu, same Gijansawaza, same Nobody, that chance was a nobody same knowledge over there. She's not that Gedina, so some Shiba, Gedina, Lord, Dena, and Pesheta Yediba, just a Nuba Simit in the Yedibarwa. Then Dina Shing Anzuki gave Chawa Karatubine, Nuba Simit in the Yedibaza, Digi, Chema, Anzulobno, that is Janko de Mahobana Pesheta, that is Jay de Tivurwa. On dinner, that is Gawakar, same hit in the Shagor, just a same hit in the Shabaza, same the Korongidi, Nakazeba the Dudu, Kautovina, nobody did me on the Yobaza, and Jebudi to Yongor. What? And that day, just an Kawatum, same hit into Kawatuko, Mahobana, the table, Yungur said, Jumten reduced in some dana, the Hakotoya Chagor.
Previous segment, I emphasized the importance for developing the mind to take extra care of our mind, place this as an emphasis. And now to talk about, to try and show how through causes created in the mind, we will later experience their effects. We can come to see how this works through analogies or our experiences in our own lived experiences. So, for example, that when we're younger, we engaged in first perhaps with our parents some education and certainly the imparting of values, and then when we got a little older, we went to school and perhaps then for further education, and over that entire period, we were gathering knowledge, we were being trained not just with knowledge being imparted to us, but we are being trained in the development of varying skills. And perhaps, depending on what one's further education was, other skills were learned. Certainly skills such as critical thinking, how to problem solve and so forth. These one learned when we were young. So to learn these involved us as pupils or as students to not just merely learn, but to train our mind, especially where we are developing skills, not merely gathering knowledge, but training to develop skills such as problem solving, etc. Then, in this way, we are gathering imprints, we're gathering skills. Now, many years later, those skills we learned when we were young, and some perhaps a lot, but certainly at least some of the knowledge that we learned, we still remember. But certainly those skills we learned, also the values that were we picked up, that were imparted to us and we picked up, as well as our various lived experiences from life, all of those had a mental impact on us. And that ripens later in life, perhaps once, perhaps many times. So in this way, we can see how over the course of this lifetime, the mental imprints we created have an impact. Perhaps not for in some cases, the impact is almost continuous, very regular. Others perhaps not for a long time, and then suddenly it comes. So this is, we can take then to understand how the accruing of karmic imprints works. That we, through particular mental attitudes, we create imprints which later ripen. And so through this analogy, we can hopefully gain confidence in the importance of taking care of our mind, of training our mind. Because in a very ordinary worldly sense, if one's mind has been trained well in society, one will have great benefit in life. So too, from the religious perspective, through developing virtuous karmic imprints, through thinking in wholesome ways, one will experience great benefits.
나위에 샤바 네 지지시 루기 샤바 세데 원보 겐 디솔레 데네 아 샤바 릭미도아르 주 용고르 조데 이기 샤바데 아마로체 고치자당한 저기 개와 치마 루그레세데 마가지 마시 우마시녀네 미 샤바다 나위에 샤바 네 샤바 지 루기 샤바데 제자 다시 매바차루 고르와 데 이기 샤바 하디고 제자 도어디 개왕아마 네 대래원 대내 치마로한테 이기셔봐들에 마음바나 상기고 뭐 토에데 이기셔봐도 상기살 두고 맞아 다른 가서 디수부도 상기살 줘야스까요 말에 제가 대내 장한저 이기셔봐디 상기살 줘하래 제가 대내 자다 이기셔봐디 상기적 줘가지고 개회 냠내 셈기 된도 이기셔봐데 뉴바디 샤용으로 제가 이기셔봐 뉴바디 바샤도 곧 상기살 줘한테 이기셔봐들와 지금 콜리아 게주 개와드 삼로드 개와드 가지 슈체차는 상해설이야 다냐야 두고로다 돈나디로와 지금데 그 이기시에 때도 샤면은 수비 때도 봐 개와드 예샤 삼로드 이기시에 자기매나 이기시바도 수비 메다도 이 개와드 예차 메와차 좋아서 메라 판도 메라와 지금데 지금 니기 이기시에 때는 샤바도 이기시에 봐 셰바나는 조 이기시에 봐데 이기시에 봐라야 지금 저기 이 넘버 셰바세 도어를 뒤셔는데 먼저 상해살로 지상한도 계획까지 좀나 뉴버르샤나 데라 이 넘버 셰바들레 계획 뉴버디 슈처셔자고래 대개와 뉴버까지 슈처르나고 상해 고원 토야랴 타녀로고래 먼저 디비 콩도다 녀모버 디비게까지 슈처르나 니 망가지 마지나 디 뉴버디 이 넘버 셰베테도 뉴버디 마와 차로고래 딘 마와 차나 슈글마 디마 텐제 상예살라 타바다 탐지기 먹고 발이야 줘야려 로투고마 가지고 봐네 디로와 제가 두스체네 가겐데 디게 가고 봐 바셰스 제가 바셰리고 빵자레스 디메바 마스나 야조토 메자데 디메바 소야디 삼로데 기회 삼로 가제 개체 다제네 미기회 삼로 콘 녀모베 삼로데 바기에 마주가 가 뉴르 다니마 기게네 마 뉴르 다 뉴르 땅게 지금 간sam질에 고 균에 기에 매봐 쇠샤 균에 기에 매봐 사이도 근데 then 개화자야로다. 지자다 디니스 그 유니게 매발 소용도 갑로든 개화자야사자 가리 개화자냐 디니산에 고원토래 타냐 조조조 저 책으로 와. 그것은 강제바의 셈기 자와체의 개화자야 두병으로 와. 지자는 개화자야 두병나 게 뭐라도 가서 교화 따스는 교화 리그로 와. 디나시로 와다. 지자다 가브리엘의 개화도 사양 될야는 지 디버샤 디버마 슈시버산 디마 텐제야 줘야라 가지고 도나디로와 제가 방자 매와 쓰고서 제가 한주 롭장 제 소디 제가 셈톤에 개화도 두체고를 해야지 제가 데니게 삼노탄에 개화 두스탄 따야들야 땅땅 랍칸디다 개위신지 랍고고와 데네진 땅고래 데네된 삼 땅고래서 딜랍칸디 제가 딜랍칸 개위신디 개침무시고래 사지 제가 데네게 침무래 제가 데네게 개침무지려 안는 디전 라기메 사다 파 샤샤바 데네게 제바이나 땅안소로 용침무라고 해서 디버침무사고 해서 용침무라고 해서 나디시고로 아다 나닝버로 디르도
There are differing ways to present the mind, to divide the mind, to understand the mind. We can divide it then into the various sense consciousnesses and the mental consciousness. And amongst these, it's the mental consciousness which is primary. The sense consciousnesses are to what perhaps, for example, sound appears to the ears, or color and shape appears to the eyes, or mere taste appears to the tongue consciousness. But it's the mental consciousness which processes these, gives them, maybe we could say, gives them life, gives them energy, gives them understanding. And of these different consciousnesses, we should be very clear that it's the mental consciousness that we should focus our attention on. It's the primary consciousness, because this is the consciousness that travels from life to life. When we exhale for the last time in this body, the various sense consciousnesses, they will dissolve. The body then gets left behind as the mental consciousness continues to its new body. And accompanying this mental consciousness will be our various karmic imprints, virtuous and non-virtuous. So this then is what we need to pay close attention to. And it's our mental consciousness that progresses towards enlightenment. So when we are cultivating virtue, or cultivating virtuous imprints, this means our mental consciousness is arising arising as wholesome consciousnesses or virtuous consciousnesses, such as ethics, love, wisdom, and so forth, and placing imprints onto the mental consciousness, strengthening its habituation to these wholesome ways of thinking. And in this way, our mental consciousness is progressing towards enlightenment. But unwholesome consciousnesses, the afflictions, these serve to impede our spiritual progression. So through this description, you can perhaps create a mental picture, and through this mental picture, come to a greater understanding of the need to reduce the frequency and the strength of the afflictions, seeing them as impeding our mental consciousness, obscuring, binding, restricting our mental consciousness, restricting its spiritual development, its progression towards enlightenment. But on the other hand, as we weaken these afflictions, weaken their grip on us, and we strengthen, and we do so through strengthening our wholesome, virtuous minds, so that they serve to shake their afflictions loose, we then can continue our spiritual development. And as we progress, make spiritual progression, what this means is these wholesome minds arise ever more easily, ever more strongly, and dominate ever more. This is how one experiences spiritual development. Those afflictions start to ripen less often. One becomes more skilled in repelling them as they ripen. They don't abide so long, they're not so powerful anymore. This all comes about through us taking care of our mind, ensuring that the afflictions, we don't allow them to dominate. And how to do so? Through following the guidance of our spiritual teacher. The guidance from our spiritual teacher which helps us identify which minds are wholesome and to cultivate, and which are unwholesome and to be abandoned. And through following the guidance of our spiritual teacher, we'll know how to strengthen our familiarity to the wholesome minds and break our habituation to unwholesome minds. So this is the process in brief, in a nutshell, of what we need to do to spiritually develop. And it also shows the great importance of the relationship with our spiritual teacher, of our great need to rely on his guidance. And therefore, we can understand the great misdeed that will follow through abandoning him, turning our back upon him.
주기 제산 냠는 제고래 세디 삼로 나네 기위 삼로 파 야처지 땅고래 세디 제산다 땅고비 김체다 김체 은혜라도 삼비게 삼로 중으로와 제산 데네자도 신의 제바 데네게 제바치는 지도 삼다도 제와 치마세 데네 여사데 여바래 세디 땅고 여사데 삼바데 데네게 다 여바 타체 레바 레샤서 여 타체 버레샤 삼비게 삼다도 제산 땅 주기 지코와래 내중 숙침부터 끼마도도 초진에 개와치마디 니수대가서 하고 그거 말와 지난 개와치마 여러배서는 여러 레고르데 여러 레고르데 딕보용거리 해야지 냐와 여러 지지 여러서 시고르데 이내다 디 유상대 유비 김자 유도 심지제 유다 셈 딩닝 해바지 많이 버리자 땅 해바 많이도 안 될야 안 지텔레 탈도게 삼로대야 숙침부식대 두고 말해 제가 내내 탈도게 삼보 숙침메데 탈바 톱되기 되니 dim바 숙침을 내두고 말 내내자 당도 진에 심주의 제자바제다 디도스 개와 치마데 여바데 땡데로지 하고 내버 녀바이나 되네 개와 치마디게 될야 탈도게 삼바 델레 타고도 셈베 삼게다 아니지 다 타바 델레 타바 마tum 탑민도 셈베 예조게디 레라 용도공이 서와 지산데에서 아주 도시네 다도 삼다 제바체 아주게 다리 제바체에 등 아주게 세대당 아주게 넘균네 레가 제다다 지 규름데 파균데기 도시 용다데 파 라바라바 삼다나 레라 하고 도야디 최고로와 데네자 도시는 아주 심지하고데 예치마차고 데네자 돈다 님보다 돈다라 아주 개외신인데 로 세디 진소 로바이나 세디 당보 개외신인데 다 디자네 제젤야 디자네가 사와 짜오기는 최슈구메 데디나다 최슈구메 딜라마딩이 띵이메 최슈구메 선배 삼로 개외이나 다디 데네 라마 로바 라마 개외신인데 로바를 해제르와 다 데네 로네다 데네 양직 파 지게 소수의 삼롱 안바다 견주에다 내수 가제 두자로 섬 가제만 제베네 디버망아 사고로와 디버 슈치에다 가제 사베네 디제부 동안 용어야디 디바디 니바스미 되는 샤바자 마오바네 셈네가 오토베네 진짜디 제부디 니베디 미요디 동안 용어야디 차고로 와서 도나닝보데 디레 디네자당 아주게 디 제장한 쪽에 동안 용어도 먹어봐 인자 동안 용어의 유 데니게 삼로디 게마주에 답시고래 사지 나니 보디 디송고래
To summarize some of the points we've made tonight, but even before so, just to remind ourselves that the meaning of practice is to train one's mind. And how to train one's mind? We need a trainer, we need someone to guide us in the whole process of training our mind. And this is the role of the spiritual teacher, hence the importance of the spiritual teacher and why it's at the outset, at the beginning of the text, and why we're looking at it here. So further, what we looked at tonight was that the various topics of the Dharma, they all need to be realized in order for them to have a transformative impact on our lives, on our way of thinking. And this, in particular, because so many topics of the Dharma we cannot see for ourselves, we have to think about their meaning. In other words, to take, for example, that there are future lives. This is difficult to really recognize for oneself because we cannot see our next life. But we need to therefore think about whether there are future lives or not, and ascertain that through reasoning. Because if we ascertain that there are future lives, then we can ascertain, hopefully, that there are lives beyond the human and animal realm. And we can therefore recognize that there are, for example, a variety of lower realms. And again, this is difficult to do without thinking about it and relying on reasons. And if one does, or if one does not rather, how will you experience that? You may intellectually accept that there are future lives, that there are lower realms, but you will not have you will not be living under your life guided with the understanding that I have to avoid certain causes because if they ripen at death, I will be born in the lower realms. Therefore, because you haven't come to realize that there are lower realms and that you may well be born there, one has not given rise to a determination to be liberated from being born in the lower realms, which is the outcome of the training of a practitioner of initial capacity. So therefore, without having reflected based on reasons on the lower realms and the causes that lead to their rebirth there, one cannot give rise to the determination to gain liberation from being born in the lower realms. But if one does reflect in this way, and then reflect on all the realms of samsara and the causes for being there, using reasoning, leading to certainty in future lives, in certain causes leading to specific results and so forth, then the mind of definite emergence will arise. Then the last point that we looked at, the last point to summarize that we looked at tonight, was that the very meaning of abandoning the spiritual teacher is a thought such as, I will not rely on him any further. I want nothing to do with him anymore. So it's this kind of severing of relationship from the side of the student that incurs the abandoning of the spiritual teacher. And the strength of that mind will vary, and therefore the mind is the cause of the ripening result, and therefore because the strength of the mind varies, the strength of the ripening result will vary. Nevertheless, though, this is something we should avoid at all costs. Thank you. We'll conclude therefore tonight. If you have questions, then there will be time tomorrow. So thank you.